Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for Putting Your Money Where Your Soul Is, Jewish wisdom and socially responsible investing with Rabbi Jacob Siegel. I also want to thank Temple Solel for co-sponsoring today's program and invite Mason Marks to introduce today's guest speaker.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you could all make it. Today we have a very important topic, putting your money where your soul is, Jewish wisdom and socially responsible investing. This is being presented by Rabbi Jacob Siegel. Rabbi Jacob Siegel has spent years working with individuals and institutions across North America to bring Jewish values and wisdom to bear on investment decisions and to invest in a climate-smart future. He received rabbinic ordination from Yeshivat Chovevei Torah and earned his undergraduate in mathematics from Washington University in St. Louis. He lives in Eugene, Oregon with his family, where he serves on the board of his local Jewish Federation and his local credit union. And I'd just like to say this is a very important topic for us in Paradise Valley at Temple Solel. It's pretty warm this summer. It was very warm last summer, so look forward to hearing the lecture. Thank you, Rabbi.
Great. Thank you so much, Mason, for that introduction. And thank you so much, Alex, for pulling everything together. And it's great to see all of you here on the call. And I know there will be some folks who are also listening asynchronously. So thanks for tuning in. Actually, let's not do the slides yet, because I'll start with a story. So my interest in this topic, and really my first encounter with socially responsible investing, was when I opened up my first retirement account, which was also around the same time that I was starting rabbinical school. And I was thinking to myself, I'm going to need to be a model for everything I do. If I'm seeking to be a communal leader, I should probably do the same thing with my investment portfolio. So I started researching, how do I align my brand new retirement account with Jewish values? And it was really hard to find information that I understood or that was speaking to the modern questions that the socially responsible investing field, as it's grown, was asking. It was just very hard to find that information in a practical way. And layer on top of that, that was also the same fall when Superstorm Sandy swept through New York, and I have vivid memories of catching the last train out of Penn Station before they shut down the station because of the incoming flooding, and remembering the news making the connection between extreme weather events and climate change, and eventually also between the fossil fuel industry and the burning of fossil fuels as one of the primary drivers. Anyway, so all this was sort of fomenting for me at the same time. Fast forward a number of years, I was really blessed after rabbinical school to be able to work for a number of years with a Jewish socially responsible investing organization and engaged in advocacy, shareholder advocacy with major public corporations, dive deep into Jewish values. I continue to do that work with, as Mason noted, a focus on climate. And I can talk more about climate as one issue area later. But just the broad field was so interesting to me. The question of how do Jewish values do they have anything to say about my retirement account, about our organization's endowments, about our pension funds? And that was what led me to write this book that Alex was sort of previewing with a slide. But it's called Put Your Money Where Your Soul Is, Jewish Wisdom to Transform Your Investments for Good. And this is really, I wrote it because it's the book I wish I would have had when I was first learning about this. And so I tried to answer all the questions that I remember having in that early stage. And then the other reason to be thinking about this, particularly as Jews, is because the faith community broadly writ and specific faith communities have played a central role in creating what is now a burgeoning socially responsible investing arena. So there's a tremendous opportunity to let our values and our faith and our religious communal perspectives lead us into this. The way the story is often told about modern socially responsible investing, it typically starts around the year 1970, which is when South African apartheid was gripping the conscience of the American public, and the Episcopal Church attended the General Motors shareholder meeting and some representatives from the Episcopal Church, they were shareholders in their investment funds, and they publicly stood up and called on the company to stop profiting from the apartheid regime in South Africa. At the same time, there were groups of nuns and other investors who were noticing that there were, banks and other mainstream financial institutions that were refusing to lend in certain communities that had been redlined and that were seen as too risky, often communities of color, poorer communities. And so this group of nuns sought to move capital that they had through their investment vehicles to the people who needed it most in order to build their own businesses, to build their own communities, and in ways that they were being shut out of the traditional financial system. So that developed the whole field of community development finance, again, inspired by religious communities. Nowadays, socially responsible investing is huge. Some numbers cite a third of all investment capital is socially responsible or aligned with values in some way. And we know it wasn't always that way. Okay, that's the story that's typically told about socially responsible investing. There are some terms that I don't want to lose us in an alphabet soup. As we're going along, if folks have questions about specific terms, or if I'm saying something that isn't accessible to you, please let me know in the chat, and I'll try to define everything I'm talking about. Like any field, this field can get its own jargon and acronyms. I want it to be understandable. So some things to note. When we talk about socially responsible investing, we're not talking about philanthropy. And it's confusing because sometimes people in the philanthropic sector will talk about an investment. Will you invest in this nonprofit? But what they mean is, will you make a donation to this nonprofit and not expect to get any of that money back and just see, that the nonprofit does good work in the world? Investing, the way we're talking about it, means you get your money back, plus usually a financial return. So that's really specifically, this is not about philanthropy. This is about how to take if we're giving away, ideally 10 to 20% of our assets, Maimonides, suggests, based on earlier sources in the Talmud, that ideally we'd go up to 20%, but 10% is at least a good amount to start with. In the United States, foundations are legally required to give away 5%. So the question of what's happening to that other 95%, that's what we're focused on. That's a huge amount of money, and it's a huge amount of power that we can use to shift the world for better. Okay, the second term on this list is socially responsible investing, and you'll hear a whole bunch of terms thrown around. One of the most common jargon acronyms you hear nowadays is ESG, and it broadly stands for environment, social, and governance, which are three categories that capture the concerns that investors in a particular company might have. ESG also sometimes means scoring companies on how well they do on those different buckets, like what's your score on an E and an S and a G, and only picking the best companies that score well to invest in. One approach. There are lots of approaches. And then there's lots of other terms. Impact investing, you'll hear. Sometimes impact investing is like a specific investment to a nonprofit coffee farming cooperative in Rwanda. That's, when you think of impact investing. But impact investing can also mean more broadly, just another term for socially responsible investing. It's looking at our investments which have an impact on the world. And the only question is, are we aware of that impact? And do we like that impact, or do we want to change it? So impact investing is another term. You'll hear a lot of other terms. And then the last term I want to mention, and it's going to come up in a little bit in our conversation, is financial return. Again, we're looking to get our money back plus a financial return. And there's been a sort of default set of assumptions that I'm both going to affirm and question when we get there in good Jewish fashion around what's an appropriate financial return. What should we as individuals saving for our own retirement? What should we as institutions who need to fund essential programs, what should we be aiming for in financial return? The story that I told you a couple of minutes ago about the evolution of the socially responsible investing field, starting in the 1970s and all through its growth even until today, is how the story is normally told. And it's a beautiful story, but but there's a problem with it, which is it doesn't actually make any sense that investors only sought to bring their values into their investments about 5 or 6 decades ago. Like, Jewish tradition has been valuing business ethics for thousands of years. Professor Meir Tamari from the Jerusalem Center of Business Ethics went through and cataloged of the 613 mitzvot that over 100 are related to business ethics, and compare that to something like 28 for kashrut. So business ethics are huge in Jewish community and Jewish tradition. We're not alone. There are other faith traditions that have deeply cared about the issue of business ethics. So the question is really not when did socially responsible investing start, but when did mainstream investing stop being driven by values in the first place? So that's the question. That's one of the questions that motivated me early in the book, in the journey that I went through. And it turns out that our economic system, which in the book I call capitalism 1.0, it's been a tremendous engine for growth. It's lifted millions or even billions of people out of poverty, humans taking power on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. My teacher, Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, talks about this, about the incredible benefits that have come from seizing power, seizing economic power, developing that. It's brought a rising standard of living for many, many people. And it's had collateral effects. It's had an epidemic of economic suffering. It's led to what is now catastrophic climate change and environmental destruction and more. So the problem is that we are a civilization out of balance. When it comes to our economics, we're out of balance. Our Jewish tradition thinks that profit is legitimate. So the rabbis of the Talmud talk about the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov, the selfish inclination, I'll translate, and the selfless, benevolent inclination. And the rabbis of the Talmud affirm that both are actually essential. We need both the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer Tov. The rabbis of the Talmud tell a story about a time when the Yetzer Hara was captured. They managed to somehow, it's an amazing story. The rabbis of the Talmud captured the evil, the selfish inclination, and imprisoned it. And during that time, for 3 days, there was not a single egg laid in the entire land of Israel. Another similar story where nobody wanted to build a house, nobody wanted to start a family, right? We need that self-centered, selfish inclination. It's part of what it means to be human. And it needs to be in balance, right? We can't just be focused on selfish inclinations. The economist Milton Friedman, writing in 1970, in the New York Times, had an op-ed titled "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." I sort of love to hate on that quote from Milton Friedman. To be fair to Milton Friedman, there's a little bit more nuance in there, but the broad sort of argument of the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. The thing that should matter is only profit. That runs contrary to every major Jewish business ethicist of the 20th century, who all note that profit is legitimate and it cannot be the supreme value. Profit in Jewish tradition is not supreme. There are other values that are supreme. I'm an Orthodox rabbi, so I have a clear sense of, the supreme with a capital S, but there's lots of values of, learning Torah and giving to the poor and lots of other things that are actually meant to be sort of unbounded or limitless. And profit is not one of those. I'm just going to pause because I do see a question in the chat. Okay, so Warren is sort of hinting in the chat at a question about performance, financial performance. So we're going to get there in just a couple of minutes about how do socially responsible investing funds perform financially. And to put it another way, am I going to sacrifice money by investing socially responsibly? And does that mean I shouldn't do it? So, but just to start with that question of profit is legitimate and it cannot be the supreme value. It's become in our society the supreme value. We're a civilization out of balance. So Judaism has amazing countercultural wisdom about how to live in balance. And one of those pieces of wisdom is what Professor Meir Tamari from the Jerusalem Center of Business Ethics calls what is enough, or finding enough. And so I remember my wife and I did this exercise shortly after we were married. We weren't, not that long after, where we sat down and we wrote out for ourselves what is enough. And we didn't use any dollar numbers. we described we'd like to have this kind of community. We'd like to be living in this kind of space for our home. We'd like to be able to afford these kinds of experiences for our children, but we didn't put a dollar amount on any of it. We sort of tried to calculate what is enough. The other thing we did is that we came up with what's too much. And for that one, we did put a dollar number because it's so easy to let that number shift over time. And I was recently talking about this with a friend in my Jewish community who noted, like, can you really put a dollar amount on too much? I mean, the cost of living is going, housing, cost of everything is increasing. College education for children has gotten so expensive. How can you really say there is such a thing as too much? And I said, okay, what about $100 million? And I was being a little facetious, right? I was like, surely we can come up with something that is too much. And the person conceded. And you're like, so work backwards. I don't, most of us, I am not at risk of acquiring $100 million, but there are people in my life who are, in that category. So, and also to note that enough looks different for different people and too much looks different for different people. So depending on your life circumstances, psychologically, family-wise, there's a whole host of reasons why enough and too much might look different. And I don't mean to be facetious about it, but I do mean to say that it's a really important exercise as a countercultural value to really live into what Professor Tamari calls the economics of enough, to think about what is enough and what's too much. And there is such a thing, the idea that there could be such a thing as too much. Okay, so let's talk about financial return. There has been a myth since the founding of the socially responsible investing arena 50 years ago that socially responsible investing, aligning our investments with our values, requires a sacrifice of financial return. That has been a conception since the beginning. It has at this point been resoundingly disproven. It's been proven that it's possible to invest, to meaningfully incorporate values in different ways into an investment portfolio without sacrificing financial return. And the studies that study this number into the thousands. So there was recently a study that it was a meta study that compiled about 2,000 different studies on that acronym ESG that I mentioned. And it found that on average, ESG funds tend to be neutral when it comes to performance or slightly boost performance. And, you can find studies that say the opposite. There's certainly controversy there, but it does seem, and I'll say from lived experience, having worked at a socially responsible investing organization, that it is possible. There are ways to incorporate values to some extent into an investment portfolio without sacrificing financial return. So if that's true, and I'm happy to hear some sort of challenges to that in a minute, but I want to let's sort of assume that were true. If that's true, that we could engage in socially responsible investing without sacrificing our retirement or, without sacrificing any financial return from what we expect, do we have a Jewish obligation to do it? So it turns out there's a really beautiful text that speaks directly to this question. It's amazing. It was written, 2,000 years ago, 1,800 years ago, or compiled 1,800 years ago, but it speaks directly to this topic. So I'll read this out. This text is from Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Ancestors, which I know Rav Shmuley has a new translation out, new commentary out of. So, it's such a rich text. And this particular Mishnah says, there are 4 types of character in human beings. One that says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. That's commonplace. And some say that's a type of character of Sodom. Another type of character says, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine. That's an unlearned person, an Am Haaretz. One type of character says, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is yours. That is a pious person. And then somebody that says, what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine, that's a wicked person. So we've got these 4 types of characters. 2 of them are pretty easy to understand, right? It's pretty easy to understand what's mine is mine and what's yours is mine as wicked. And it's also pretty easy to understand that ideally, piously, we should all be striving towards, what's yours is yours and what's mine is yours. It's very generous. That's great. That's not, we can't build an investment portfolio off of that. So then there's this one in the middle, what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. That's the sort of, you could almost call it naive approach, that, that person wants the world to function in a very generous way, but it sort of misses the point of human nature. That's at least the rabbi's analysis, is that that misses the Yetzer Hara component, that misses the self-centered urge. And then what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. This is commonplace. And we might think of that as like pretty normal, but it's also a Sodom type of character. And what does that mean? So this is not our modern associations, Christian associations with the word sodomy. In the Torah, it's not explicitly explained what Sodom did to warrant destruction, the city of Sodom. So the rabbis understand that what the city of Sodom did to warrant destruction at God's hand, how were they so evil? Well, that's the comment at the bottom of the page here. Rashi, the medieval commentator, commenting on this text, who says, their sin was that they refused to help somebody else even when it cost them nothing, even when they suffered no loss. That kind of selfishness is a destructive selfishness that will ultimately destroy society. That is a sodomite type of selfishness. If we can help somebody else, or if we can help the broader world without suffering a loss ourselves, not to do so would run counter to the moral fabric of what our religion teaches. To take it a step further, the rabbis in the Talmud talk about this quality, and they name a couple of instances where it comes up. It comes up in inheritance, maybe when somebody could just let their brother have this field instead of that field, and it wouldn't cost them anything. And the rabbis say, Kofina midat Sodom. We compel people regarding the character of Sodom. And we don't do that today, you should understand, but that's a serious statement. Not only do we expect, not only is it a moral ideal, but we can actually go so far as to communally expect people to help others when it costs them nothing. So that, to me, that text, we compel regarding the character of Sodom, when it costs nothing, we're obligated to help. That, to me, speaks exactly to this question. And there's a couple of different layers here. The first is, if it costs us nothing, we're obligated to help. So I would argue, and I do in this book, that if we can find a way to bring our values into our investment portfolios without compromising our financial returns in the long term, we have a Jewish obligation to do so. Now, what that looks like is going to really depend, and there's a lot more information later in the book that will talk about that, but we have an obligation to do so. If it's going to cost us, and there are investment opportunities that are incredibly impactful where one might earn a 2% return and be achieving incredible impact, as opposed to investing in the stock market and receiving an 8% return or whatever the return happens to be. So there are instances of suffering a loss. This text would suggest that is an amazing thing to do, but we're not obligated to do it. And maybe if we've done the work to figure out what is enough and what is too much, and maybe for individuals who have really reached that point of too much, that's a meaningful step to take, to say, I'm going to let my investment capital earn less than it could. It's still going to return a rate of return, but it's going to be invested in something that is so incredibly impactful. And the field that I mentioned earlier of community development finance, that group of nuns started in the 1970s, that was really founded on this. Community development finance doesn't provide the same returns that a stock market investment does, but it's so impactful at directing capital to people who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. This text captures that, right? If we have to sacrifice return, it's a great thing to do. It's a meaningful thing to aspire for spiritually, but it's not an obligation. Okay, I see Warren noting that it's true so Warren's noting it's not always easy to do an apples-to-apples comparison of ESG funds. I'll also note that ESG funds are a particular subcategory of socially responsible investing funds. Right? There's lots of ways to do socially responsible investing. One of them is to find an ESG fund. Some of those ESG funds are hard to compare apples to apples. I'll say, for example, there are funds whose investments look very similar to a standard fund, but those funds might engage in something called shareholder advocacy. We can talk about that a little bit more when we get to talking about corporations. But shareholder advocacy is a way to use one's power as a shareholder, as an investor, to pressure corporations to improve their behavior on a whole range of, whether it's environmental or social or governance issues. And that doesn't necessarily cost an investor anything in terms of, they might still be invested in the same companies, but increases the impact. So I would just push back, Warren, and say that there are ways to achieve, there are ways to achieve meaningful socially responsible alignment or achieve impact, even within a traditional investment vehicle. Or there are investment vehicles, depending on the ones that we choose, that are able to return a financial return on par with what one would expect from the stock market. That said, and this is like a little caveat here. That said, there are also those in the community development finance arena who note that we're never going to solve things like global poverty at a market rate of return. If it was that easy, we would have already done that. And this is a really difficult topic to talk about because I feel like as a person in the socially responsible investing world, we've worked so hard to dismantle the myth that socially responsible investing always means sacrificing financial return, that whoever does it, there's like the Venn diagram of people who are interested in there's socially responsible investing and financial return. And we've assumed that we can't get in the middle. And so people have sort of ditched the socially responsible investing. And that is an unfortunate moral reality, and I think something for us to probe. But we've worked so hard to say there is space in the middle of that Venn diagram. And so to question how meaningful that space is very difficult. But I do think that there is space in the middle of that Venn diagram, and there's space outside, on the edges to say we can achieve a on-par financial return, and there are other opportunities. Okay, let's pause. Amy is mentioning, yes, the Green Book of Impact Investing, published by the Jewish Funders Network, published by Michael Lustig, who is a huge champion of this topic of socially responsible investing and impact investing. He's really been a leader within the Jewish community at Jewish Funders Network and other places. So absolutely, that's a great resource. I reference it in the book. Michael and I have had great conversations about this, and he's really trying to elevate this topic within the Jewish community. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Other folks, feel free to drop additional questions into the chat and comments. So I want to start by talking about, I want to transition next to talking about negative screens. Negative screens is another word for not investing in something, in a certain company, in a certain sector. And it is where, in some ways, the socially responsible investing field began. So the Christian community, the Protestant community in particular, really deserves a lot of credit for being some of the first. Like I mentioned, the Episcopal Church at General Motors in 1970, they were some of the first to try to engage in this socially responsible investing, and they started with what are sort of called in the field the sin stocks, so alcohol, gambling, tobacco, sometimes firearms. That definition of sin stock, or sort of those items that an investor who is engaged in ethical investing wouldn't want to invest in, that's been through the socially responsible investing field, even in secular funds up until today. Those are very common negative screens, very common places that investors will choose not to invest. That said, there are interesting ways in which they do and don't align with a Jewish perspective. So it behooves us to ask the question, what does Judaism have to say about negative screens? So the Jewish conversation about negative screens, about where should we not be invested, are there certain investments that are against our values? It really starts with this verse in the Torah. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God. I am the Lord. This is it comes in a series of exhortations. Included in that list is you shall surely rebuke your fellow. That's in the same chapter in Leviticus. So all of these exhortations, and one of them is don't put a stumbling block before the blind. And the rabbis see that and they say, well, obviously it's not talking about a literal stumbling block because we wouldn't need the Torah to teach us that that's immoral, right? Obviously it's immoral to place a stumbling block before a blind person. So this must be teaching us something more. This must be expanding the category here. What it means is don't be a part of any activity that could run contrary to your values. Don't place a stumbling block before the blind. Don't cause anybody else to trip up in any way, metaphorical or literal. That's a very expansive approach. The rabbis are sort of a pendulum here, right? If you literally just read the text of the Torah without any of that context, you might think it was pretty narrow. It's just talking about a stumbling block and a blind person. The rabbis expand it, so it's far more expansive. And in fact, in some ways impedes daily functioning in society, right? Does that mean that if, my day job is around climate change, and we know that fossil fuels are the primary contributors to what is now a climate crisis that's causing millions of people to, that leads to 8 million deaths every year and is accelerating and all the terrible things. And we know that. And we know that as a society, we have to work towards weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels. But it's impossible to live my daily life without some touch point of a fossil, with a car. I don't own an electric car yet. How the building where my office might be powered. It's, all these different ways that it's actually impossible to totally divorce myself. So, do I need to live as a hermit? And there are other examples too. If a society is supporting an immoral kind of behavior, do I need to limit my interactions with that society? And that came up for the rabbis of the Talmud when around the topic of, I'm going to say this word and then I'm going to define it, around the topic of idol worship, around the topic of idolatry. So idolatry sounds, sometimes when I'm talking to audiences about this, sounds a little foreign, right? Idolatry, what does that have to do with my daily life? Idolatry is the act of worshiping that which is not actually supreme as supreme. Right? Pretending or imagining that the thing that isn't actually the most important thing is the most important thing. And so Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory from the United Kingdom had a great quote about how there are a lot of different idols. One of them is politics. We fall into the lap of a political party. His quote is something like, we fall into the lap of a political party that promises salvation from our ills instead of doing the hard work ourselves. And another idol is economics. So, maybe not literally, but at least figuratively, like I mentioned, we live in a society out of balance. So what does it mean that the society around us, the society at the time of the rabbis was so opposed to those sets of values? Do we have to totally divorce ourselves from society? The pendulum swung back. And so later rabbis said, we don't have to totally divorce ourselves from society, but we have to be conscious of whether our investments whether our actions, and in our case, our investments, are aiding and abetting somebody to commit an unethical act. Are they necessary for somebody to commit an unethical act? Are we actively supporting it? There are all these sort of nuances and gray areas. So some places that comes up, let's take as an example, as a case study, let's take tobacco. Should a Jewish investor be invested in tobacco? So we know that modern tobacco companies, modern cigarettes, are the leading cause. I think I'm getting these statistics right, but somebody correct me if I'm misstating them. But I think they're the leading cause of preventable death in the United States, leading to hundreds of thousands of deaths a year. Just a huge, it's the only product that, when used as directed, leads to slowly killing the person who's using it. I've heard that quote. So different ways to note that this industry is really not an ethical industry, right? This product is not an ethical product. And in fact, every major denomination, from the Orthodox with the RCA and all the way across the spectrum, have put out statements stating that smoking cigarettes runs contrary to Jewish law and Jewish values. Okay, so if that's the case, what about investing in a tobacco company? Investing in a tobacco company means I'm buying shares of a company, unless that company is issuing new shares, I'm just buying shares that I'm sort of trading on what's called the secondary market. I'm just buying them from somebody else. I'm not actually getting them from the company. I'm buying them from somebody else who wanted to sell them, right? Nothing new is flowing to the company. Is that really a problem? Well, maybe not. But then when I own the share, I'm profiting from the company. Well, but what if I own the company as a part of a mutual fund or an index fund? So we get these nuanced layers here, right? You could say maybe you can make a claim that if I own an index fund or a mutual fund and the fund owner chooses tobacco, maybe I'm less culpable. Really, ultimately, though, right, when it comes down to a gut level, it doesn't feel right. Knowing all we know about what Jewish investors have said, what rabbis and denominations have said about tobacco, it doesn't seem right that we should be invested in it. That's an example of what would be an appropriate negative screen. There are others. Let's pause for a moment. Warren has a great comment about alcohol, right? So alcohol is not the same kind of negative screen in Jewish tradition that it is in Christian tradition, because we use alcohol. We use wine for celebrations. everything should be done in moderation, of course, but drinking is not a sin in Jewish tradition in the way that it is in Christian tradition or even in Muslim tradition. So that wouldn't necessarily be a negative screen for Jewish investors. And heck, marijuana has some medicinal uses, and the Orthodox Union recently certified a medical marijuana, medical cannabis. So, like, should that be a negative screen? Maybe not. What about weapons that, the defense industry seems very important to the state of Israel, but what about offensive weapons, especially ones that could be marketed to less scrupulous international actors? Is that a negative screen? What about fossil fuels? So a lot of the work that I do in my daily life, not related to the book that I published, is support Jewish institutions who have to go through the process of aligning their investments with their Jewish values and screening out fossil fuels and investing in a clean energy future. So it's an interesting question that I'm not going to fully answer right now, but I'll just flag that question of what should we not be investing in. Okay, we have just a couple more minutes to go into one more topic. And then, there's so much more to say, but I'll pause there and I'll open this up to questions. But the one more topic that I want to talk about is the thing that actually we think about when we think about investing. Like if somebody, shakes you awake at 3 a.m. and says, what's an investment? This is probably what many people would say, which is it's a stock or it's a bond. It's an investment in a corporation. So corporations are a fascinating entity because they're relatively new, certainly with a Jewish timescale, right? The first publicly traded joint stock corporations, as they're called, weren't really developed until the 1800s. There were earlier forms that I talk about in my book of sort of early predecessors, but these early joint stock corporations really developed in the 1800s, less than 200 years ago. And they had a couple of unique features that had never before been seen, new inventions. One thinker at the time described one of these as the most important invention of the 19th century, which was limited liability. Meaning, normally, if I cause you some sort of damage, I cause a tort, then I have to pay back that damage. Or if I injure you, I have to pay for your medical bills. If a business that I own does that, then if the business, I'm on the hook. If the business doesn't have enough assets, then I'm the one who has to foot the bill. Limited liability says that a person who gets injured, they can only claim from the assets of the corporation. They can never touch me as an individual shareholder or stockholder. That's radically new. That's very contrary to like the way business was conducted, certainly in Jewish tradition for thousands of years. So the modern corporation brought some new and very complicated questions to the Jewish world. And one of them is, okay, are we even allowed to invest in corporations at all as Jews? And that was a question. That was a question in the 1850s, 1860s. If there's a corporation, that fully observes all Jewish laws, that closes for Shabbat and pays its workers on time and only has kosher food, then maybe it's not an issue. But most corporations are open. If they're not open on Saturdays, they're probably open on Yom Kippur when it falls on a weekday. So can a Jewish investor invest in any corporation? And the initial answer to that question was no. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, writing in, I think it was 1862, in his volume, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, argues that at the time it was like early banks, early loan funds, that a Jewish investor can't invest in them and can't participate in them because they lend at interest, which is a whole other topic that we can talk about approaches to interest. That's another chapter in this book, but we'll leave that for now. We'll just say that this was a huge debate because it would drastically impact the lived experience of, every Jew. In fact, if we can't invest in a corporation, based on this quote that is still up on the screen, of not placing a stumbling block before the blind, can I even buy things from a corporation that is operating on Shabbat, or that is selling non-kosher food, or that is lending at interest? Can I even engage at all with that corporation? But it's really impossible to imagine living modern life. I mean, it's so hard to imagine living modern life without engaging in some way with major corporations. They're so fundamental as building blocks to our society. So there's a robust debate about investing in corporations. The other alternative, the other extreme, is to not invest. is to invest in a corporation and to not care what the corporation does. To say the corporations of today are they're their own thing. They're their own entities, right? They don't have a moral claim on me because it's not like a partnership with a group of people, all of whom are responsible. It's like its own entity. I'm just a shareholder. I don't have a moral responsibility. That is another position that is also really deeply unsatisfying, right? Like to say I'm going to wipe my hands. I mean, corporations, in addition to being major building blocks of our society, and some of them producing goods that are essential, some of them also engage in significant abuses. We know this to be true. We don't need, it's on the surface there. Do I wipe my hands of those abuses because it's a corporation doing them and I just happen to be a shareholder? So that's very morally unsatisfying also. So there's a middle path for corporations that gets articulated a little bit in the 1970s and has been really significantly built out, which is the tactic of shareholder advocacy. The idea that if I own a corporation, if I own a stock in a corporation, I have a voice, and maybe I'm allowed to own stock. Maybe we're not going to require ourselves to be hermits and cut off from the wider society. But if I do own a share, then I have a moral responsibility to use that voice to speak up and to influence corporate management to improve their behavior. That's led to a whole modern field of socially responsible investing that is about shareholder advocacy, and there are funds that are expert in engaging in shareholder advocacy. And usually it's alongside grassroots support, right? There's the grassroots environmental movement, and that's made it possible for shareholders to push companies to be more environmentally friendly. But it's been successful in different ways. That's another angle on corporations. Okay, we're going to pause there and we're going to turn things open to questions that's coming here. How about giving preferences to investing in corporations that deliberately pursue ethical practices? That's a great question. That's a little more the philosophy of ESG. So ESG funds seek to pick the best corporations or the best behaved corporations. There's different arguments for that. One argument might be maybe those corporations are more aligned with our values, but at my old workplace, we used to say there's no such thing as a perfect corporation from a Jewish perspective. So it's never going to be enough to just invest in the best corporations. We're always going to need to also raise our voices and encourage those corporations to do better. There's not a corporation that can't do better. So my approach would be to look for opportunities to do that. So first of all, determine what do I not want to be invested in from an ethical perspective, right? Because that's very powerful. It's a very ethically powerful stance to say tobacco is against my values to invest in. I'm going to not invest in that. Or I know that fossil fuels are the leading drivers of the climate crisis. Exxon knew about the climate crisis for decades and has been extremely deceptive to the American public. It's not aligned with my values to invest in fossil fuels, right? That sort of conversation. And then for the companies that I do choose to invest in, to say it's my responsibility to move them farther along the path towards a just future. Okay, other questions? And if folks want to, I also invite you to hop off mute and share your question. Also would welcome that.
Okay. I think Amy has a question.
Hi. So one of the questions I have for you is, have you seen implementations, and what are the better implementations that you have seen in terms of either community foundations or large institutions, or even at an individual level? Like, how does this, because you're presenting the theory, but what's happening in real life now in the US, in the Jewish community?
Yeah, I promise you that I do not mean to be shamelessly plugging my book, but I do profile a number of those stories in the book. So a number of the leaders in the Jewish community who have done this work, Jewish community foundations that have created impact pools, organizations that have made meaningful commitments not to invest in certain sectors, despite the complexity that entails. So yeah, I would say check out the book there's a lot of really good examples in there. I can't cover them all right now, but yeah, there's lots of exciting activity in the Jewish community right now. This field, at one point, maybe the Jewish community was less engaged. Now it feels like new stories around this are popping up left and right. In my day job, when I'm focused on climate change, I'm acutely aware that the reform movement, the Union for Reform Judaism, just announced that it was going to stop investing in fossil fuels because determined that wasn't in alignment with its values. And it was going to engage in shareholder advocacy to the extent it could with other sectors on climate change. Like that's a really interesting combination of strategies there. Anyway, so lots of things happening, lots of Jewish community foundations, institutions, individuals. Yeah.
Just in case, one second part of my question is, of course, because of what I do in my day job, where does Israel fall? Like Warren had an interesting comment where he was saying, well, if you're invested in an Israeli company that is invested in, that is doing weapons, in which point does that mean you can do it, you cannot do it? But in particular, Israel in general, because it doesn't fall into ESG necessarily, especially Michael advocates for that.
Yeah, I would separate those two questions. I would say investing in Israel is one question, and investing in weapons manufacturers, whether they're defense or not, is a separate question. That's how I would look at them. In investing in Israel, I do have a chapter in the book about investing in Israel. I draw heavily on the work that Michael has done and lots of others. The growing field of impact investing and socially responsible investing within Israel. And one of the arguments I make is that not only can investing in Israel be a Jewish value, but investing in the sustainable development of Israel. The word used in the Talmud is Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and it's the same phrase as Yishuv HaOlam, which roughly translates, I think the best translation in modern times is sustainable development of the world. And so similarly, the same phrase, sustainable development of Israel, meaning not just investing in Israel, but investing in Israeli society. There are so many amazing investments now in the periphery in Israeli society, bringing citizens of Israel who haven't had as much access to whatever it happens to be to bring them into all these different pieces of work. So there's a lot of really incredible work going on about like how to impact invest within Israel. Really exciting developments there, and so that absolutely can be a Jewish value, and I talk about that in the book. When it comes to weapons manufacturers, regardless of where they're based, it's a fascinating conversation that goes all the way back to the Talmud. And this, I don't have time to go into this right now in our presentation, but if you want to learn more, you can see the discussion in the book. The Talmud discusses selling weapons to various non-Jewish communities who presumably were hostile to the Jewish community to varying degrees, and when is it prohibited and when is it permitted. And it's actually in the same tractate, Avodah Zarah, idol worship, where those conversations about negative screens happen. So it's a really interesting conversation around the nuances that the Talmud draws that are actually directly relevant to when we would choose to maybe invest in weapons manufacturer today, or like what does it mean to be selling weapons? Fascinating discussion.
Yes, I have a question. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the nuns who objected to investing in South Africa. What do you say to the people today who stand up and say it's socially irresponsible to invest in Israel because of the Gaza situation?
Yeah, so I am an Orthodox rabbi, and I wrote a book about socially responsible investing. That is a chapter on investing in Israel. So, my cards are on the table. I do believe that there is a role for investment capital in investing in peace, and I also have a chapter in the book on investing in peace. Peace building is so important and requires a lot of capital, and it's very high risk capital. And often governments are the ones to front that capital, but there's such an important role. Those of us in the socially responsible investing arena often refer to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and goal number 16 is peace building, and it's colloquially known as the hardest goal to invest in. But that there's a huge role for investment capital to build the world that we want to see, to build peace between people, to create the economic foundation for peace. I also think that I have seen, unfortunately, that sometimes one reaction to people who seek to advocate for socially responsible or for values-aligned investing with values that I do not hold, let's say, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase that, is that sometimes I've seen people say, well, the whole field of values-based investing must be awash. right? Why would we bother to ever align our investments with our values when there are people who have such different values that are doing the same thing? And I would push back on that and say, I believe in values-based investing. I believe that it is important for people who hold values to bring them into their investment portfolios. And so, like, for example, Judaism has a very, very different approach to abortion than Catholicism. But I have lots of good friends in the Catholic world who are not comfortable investing in abortifacients because it goes against their values. And I think it's a good thing for investors and people of faith to be bringing their values into their investment portfolios in general. And then, you know, this is only like one snapshot of the broader conversations going on. So, like, the investment arena will not solve all problems, and we all know that, right? We talked about that right at the beginning, when seeking a market rate of return is not going to solve global poverty. This arena is not the arena to solve all global problems. It's an arena to express our values, and we ought to be meaningfully seeking to express our values. Does that answer your question? It was a very good question.
Sort of.
Okay. I'm happy to discuss more.
I have one comment.
Hi, Warren.
I typed a lot, I'll speak up. There's a couple things. First of all, I think that the definition of what you can say are ESG investments or socially acceptable investments, I think can be argued it is somewhat objective, but it is also very much subjective. And I think there's a difficulty in discerning one from the other. And I guess that comes down to something that I don't know if you've talked about, but I think in terms of if you're going to adopt a socially acceptable investment policy, then you have to make a policy statement. You have to, let's say you're running a pension fund. I think you have to make a sort of a resolution on what the agreed upon definition is. The other thing that I noticed is that you might be making an investment today, but you don't realize that it could be very advantageous for the Jewish people in the future. And I'll give two examples. The first is the Japanese. Their effort to fight the Russians in 1905 was underwritten by Jacob Schiff and Company, which is a predecessor company of Goldman Sachs. And the success of Japan's victory was attributed to that financing. And in World War II, it caused the Japanese in several different situations to actually protect the Jewish people from their partners, the Nazis. It influenced Consul General Sugihara in Lithuania. It also caused for the protection of the Jewish population that was primarily in Kobe.
Warren, we probably have one more minute because I want to be conscious of time.
I'm just saying that sometimes an investment today you might think it may have unintended benefits for the Jewish people in the future. And I'm giving that one example, which is the Jewish financing of warlike Japan, which turned out to be very advantageous for the Jews. Absolutely. Those are great examples. And your earlier point also is well taken, that these can be subjective and squishy areas. And so it's important to say, what do I mean by socially responsible investing? You know, what's it going to look like for me? Is it going to look like negative screens, not investing in certain sectors? Is it going to look like shareholder advocacy with corporations on issues that I care about? Is it going to look like direct investments into private enterprises that are doing amazing work on the ground? All of those are possibilities. But really good points. Okay, we're at time, so I want to hand it back to Alex. I really appreciate everybody's good and thoughtful questions, and I would love to continue the conversation. So my email's in the chat, and I hope that you will reach out.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Siegel. It was a pleasure to learn with you, and thank you all for joining us. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.